right. Are we ready? Are we ready? We're good? We're on? Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Revolution 813. We meet tonight under very dark clouds. Not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine with innumerable civilian deaths, but also in Texas as we speak with Governor Greg Abbott, who's begun an assault on trans children. As you know, the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, entered a non-binding legal memorandum stating that parents who provide what is called in the medical profession gender-affirming care for their children, so puberty-suppressing drugs or other medically accepted treatments, could be investigated for child abuse. And Governor Abbott last week directed state officials in Texas to investigate certain medical treatments as possible crimes. And we just learned this week that the Texas officials with the state's Department of Family and Protective Services have begun investigating parents of transgender adolescents for possible child abuse. According to reports, actually, the first person who has been investigated is an employee of the State Protective Services Agency who has a 16-year-old transgender child. And they've been placed on administrative leave last week, and they were visited by investigators for the agency. So we are tragically in the thick of it, in the bullseye of what Gossett refers to so powerfully in their essay, the constitutive violence of modernity. We're in the thick of what Eric Stanley writes about in Atmospheres of Violence, and Eric Stanley's claim that anti-trans queer violence is foundational to and not an aberration of modernity. I think we're at the heart of what Eric Stanley talks about when they write that the law, they write, rather than imagining the law as the mechanism through which relief from such harm might be offered, it is one of its methodologies of proliferation. Gossett focuses our attention like a laser on this space where the political struggle over LGBTQ life meets the carceral state, where questions of queer and trans rebellion meet abolitionism, and importantly, where these issues meet anti-blackness and coloniality. And that's what we're going to be focusing our discussion on tonight at this intersection of queer and trans rebellion, carcerality, anti-blackness, coloniality. It's a space of critique and praxis that I think is actually, from a theoretical perspective, very fraught because of the ways in which our own discussion, our own representations, our own recuperations of erasures and our own productions of erasures can themselves have effects of exclusion and inclusion. And I think that in part that's the debate over Stonewall that if you've read the introductory posts, and you can see that there's already kind of like a discussion of Stonewall and its role in terms of leaders, of forgotten leaders, of recuperated leaders, of questions of assimilation and resistance that is at the heart of these questions of how erasures happen, what are recuperations, and how to do that. Jack Halberstam, in an extraordinary essay as well that's on the blog, writes about this specifically, and we'll be talking about this and opening up our discussion on these themes of the ways in which the framing of Stonewall, Jack writes, as revolutionary itself, right, is part of the possibly the mainstreaming of queer culture, and they write, it condenses an array of complex aesthetic and political expressions into a series of individual acts and statements that can be readily digested within the socially accepted framework of political change and with a conventional rendering of revolutionary action, a conventional rendering of revolutionary action. So I think these are themes that we're going to address today. I think we find them as well in the works we're reading. Of course, Jack Halberstam's Trance, all of the oral histories and interviews that surrounded Stonewall, the remarkable introduction by Eric Stanley, Atmospheres of Violence. I mean, you hear it very well in Atmospheres of Violence as well, where there's this question of kind of the recuperation of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera representing, in a way, right? It performs a second-order displacement by solidifying their identities, which were in practice constantly lived in beautiful inconsistency, right? So these are many of the issues that we're going to be dealing with today in a context, in this dark context of the reality of violence, anti-trans and queer violence that's going on in this country as we speak. There's some notions that are then that become important here, notions of, in Stanley, for instance, ungovernability, with Jack Halberstam's work, notions of wildness also as ungovernability and world breaking. In Jay Gossett's work, a lot of notions of deconstruction as well. But I'm a little bit already far into the conversation, and I want to properly introduce our two brilliant guests first, and then let them open up the conversation. Che Gossett joins us, thank you. Che is the postdoctoral scholar at the Initiative for a Just Society, who thus joins an incredible team at the IJS, including Omavi Shakur, who's also here with us today, and Fonda Shen, and others who are listening. Che is a writer and critical theorist specializing in queer, trans studies, aesthetic theory, abolitionist thought, and black study. Che received their PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers University and worked with Jack Halberstam on that doctoral work, as well as with Professor Nicole Fleetwood, who you all know is the author of Marking Time, remarkable book. Their dissertation was titled Abolitionist Entanglement, Ending the Grammars of Capture, and it's a wide-ranging meditation on black trans art in the afterlife of slavery, on questions of humanness and animality through the lens of anti-black and colonial frameworks, on George Jackson's writings, and more broadly on the aporias of abolitionism, which we were just talking about today at a workshop at lunch. Actually, a workshop at lunch in which we were reading and discussing Che's brilliant chapter, Abolitionist Aporias, in which there's a line that I was saying I'm gonna always quote and use and refer to now, and it's the idea that limits need not always be boundaries, they can be thresholds. So, thank you, Che, for joining us. A prolific writer and researcher, and recently their article on trans and non-binary methods for art and art history, which was in the College Art Association Journal, just won the 2020 award for distinction as the best article in the journal for the year. So, and lots of forthcoming work. There's a lot more right here. And Che will discuss some of the work that they are working on right now involving Kiyoshi Kuromiya. Okay, and then after Che, we are joined, thank you again, by Jack Halberstam, who is professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. I'm especially happy to have Jack back with us. The last time I think we were doing a 1313 was on Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, and that was a great session too, with Heather Love and others. Jack is the author of 7 books, including, of course, Trance, which we're reading for tonight. The other ones include Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, and Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal. And of course, you know Jack's latest book, out in 2020 from Duke University Press, which is titled Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Many themes that I hold dear. Jack is now finishing a second volume on wildness titled The Wild Beyond, Music, Architecture, and Anarchy. And their work is really extraordinary for focusing on the relationship between gender and sexuality and the built environment. So it's an extraordinary honor to have you both with us. And what I'm going to do is turn it over first to Che to open our conversation, make some remarks, then pass it on to Jack, and then we'll get the conversation going and then open it up to questions. And thank you so much for being here, and thank you for kicking us off, Che.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bernard and Jack. I just want to preface my comments by saying that it's such an honor to be in conversation with you both and your scholars and workers. You know, your labors, critical and praxis, both have been so important to me, and you're thinkers who I've been reading for over, you know, a decade at least. So it's really an honor to kind of be at this table and be talking with you and working together in different phases. So thank you. I wanted to open actually with the same quote that you just read from Eric Stanley. So I'll repeat it and echo it again. In response to these historical and ongoing forms of degradation, which include the booming whiteness and gender normativity of what consolidates under the sign of LGBT history, Marcia and Sylvia have been revived as emblematic of a trans of color politic from Stonewall to the current moment. While important, this vital recovery performs a second-order displacement by solidifying their identities, which were, in practice, constantly lived in beautiful inconsistency. And I found this phrase, beautiful inconsistency, such a kind of catchword that shares a certain critical intimacy and proximity and affinity with the notion of becoming numerous, which is the kind of headline for this panel tonight. And we might think of a kind of family of terms that might be in the same repository. Swarm, you know, that Du Bois uses in Black Reconstruction, the swarm of fugitive enslaved people, the multitude that Hardin Negri write of, destituent power that Agamben has written of, and finally, most recently, undercommons. And so these kind of figurations of collective power don't fit into what Eric Stanley calls the neoliberalization of identity as modernity's sedimentation. And part of my own process of tracing these iterations that fracture or shatter the carceral metaphysics of the subject has been through, ironically, like working on a biography, which is all about the traditional figure of the subject and their accolades and how many accomplishments they've had and why we should all put them in the archive of history with a capital H. And so I want to kind of zero in on this figure, Kiyoshi Kuromiya, who I found out about over a decade ago, maybe 12 years ago, when I was living in Philadelphia and in grad school, and ended up joining ACT UP Philadelphia and came across this activist named Kiyoshi, who I was really moved by the scope and scale of his political commitments, which stretched from being born in an internment camp in 1943 in Hart Mountain in Wyoming, being arrested as a queer child in Monrovia, which is where his family moved to, so struggling against the criminalization of queerness as a youth, which is still obviously ongoing, and the medicalization, psychiatric power, and confinement as a child. He moved to Philly, became involved with civil rights, SDS, Black Power, was in Selma, the Selma to Montgomery March in '65, and was beaten by sheriffs, a mounted posse, to the point of near death, hospitalized, and was really radicalized by his participation in the Black freedom struggle that remains clearly today. He helped start the Gay Liberation Front in Philadelphia, and for like a decade in the 70s, late 70s, actually worked with Buckminster Fuller as his kind of quasi-editor and collaborator, And he also started an organization in the 80s at the onset of the AIDS epidemic called Critical Path AIDS Project, and helped to start ACT UP Philadelphia. And so part of the kind of problematic that I'm faced with when writing this and working on this is figuring out, biography kind of doubles as a sort of philosophical anthropology where you're trying to, it's like a funny way of coming to the question of like other minds. And it's also a sort of a process of creative nonfiction where I know his kind of historical record, but I'm also trying to recreate and give this figure narrative and flesh and form. And so what I'm doing now is a project of oral histories to kind of lift him off the page and trace what he meant to other people. But his biography is not, while he was a singular figure, he wasn't exceptional. And I'm thinking about the ways in which abolition sutures together the various movements that he was a part of that would generally be seen as discrete and separate. And it enables me to ask a set of questions that I didn't have maybe when I started researching his archive. So ACT UP Philadelphia still exists, is still organizing, and I think that looking at this specific organization enables me to think about anti-Blackness and AIDS. Since the organization has a really rich history, it's prominently Black still, and it focuses on sites of anti-Blackness and the nexus of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, so like the prison, for example, and HIV criminalization. So that's one piece, because I think that the story of HIV/AIDS has largely not, the story about HIV/AIDS and anti-Blackness has yet to kind of be comprehensively told, and the story also of ACT UP Philadelphia, because there's a similar kind of issue that happens where the narrative of Stonewall can eclipse earlier and other locations, so too with their narrative of AIDS activism that kind of orbits around New York City. So I'm hoping to complicate that. Another question that it raises has to do with Buckminster Fuller, who was his collaborator, and thinking about how is it that collaborators with Fuller were eclipsed by him in his kind of techno-futurist planetary scope and scale of his vision. And so I ask and look at his other collaborations, like with June Jordan, for example, the Black feminist poet, who also wrote of and thought of poetics of form and environmental design and justice. And they collaborated on a project around redesigning Harlem in '64, and she was kind of erased out of that. And they still remain friends, and so I'm thinking about like what are the ways in which both Kiyoshi Kuromiya and June Jordan left an impression and influenced Fuller himself. And how can we trace that? And then there's some other questions about the notion of redress, internment, and reparations, and the idea of like the use of reparations or as a form of political redress, as a form of healing, of national reconciliation. And so I'm curious about the ways in which psychoanalysis is kind of solicited and recruited into these projects of national, racial liberalism and also queer liberalism and homo-nationalism. So trauma is seen as past and recuperated and healed, and the nation can move forward in an inclusive manner. And finally, there's questions of like political violence. Kiyoshi Kuromiya was involved in a lot of struggles for decriminalization, marijuana legalization, but at the same and SDS, and at the same time, this is different than the Fanonian, George Jacksian armed struggle approach, and it raises questions about the use of the law and the instrumentalization of the law, perhaps what he may have learned from the civil rights struggle and its use of litigation under, like, especially with King. And so I'm trying to track his political allegiances. And so that's my primary focus at the moment. And it really means like telling a story of a figure that that is as much about the movements he was a part of as it is about his own, so-called individuated life. And it really troubles the notion of an individuated life that could be seen as a kind of monadic versus a shared and fleshed event, especially activism. And I guess lastly, I wanted to just say how much I appreciated your post, Jack. I really, the kind of aesthetics of catastrophe and ruin and apocalypse, and I love the part about Alvin Baltrop, who was friends with Marsha P. Johnson, photographed her. I found footage of them together as part of the research for my sister's book on her, which was really wonderful. And there's a quote from him, "In the dark, we can all be free." And I think it's so profound because it flips the visibility on its head and locates the opacity and clandestine and furtive as spaces of a kind of erotic and desiring freedom. And I also had never heard of Maxine Feldman or Beverly Buchanan, and so that was like a great archival aha moment for me. And it's interesting with Feldman because it made me wonder about the different strategies, Baltrop for a kind of furtive freedom, and Feldman that's claiming a certain form of visibility and laying a claim to recognition, and about maybe some tensions between those two, or how they might even work together. And lastly, I think there were some archival aesthetic resonances, and it made me think about my sister's film work, especially on Mary Jones. And she has a film called Salacia that came out in 2019, and it's this really interesting critical refabulation of Mary Jones's life, and it kind of resists this politics of redress, and Jones is able to kind of time travel, so space and time are plastic and malleable. And Jones, like Marsha P. Johnson, actually is really invested in cosmology. And so that was huge for Marsha. Her spirituality, Black Afro-Caribbean inheritances and traditions. And so that's a huge part of how Mary Jones kind of transports herself between time and place. And I think her work for me, problematizes the notion of the event, and which makes me think about, the notion of Stonewall as an event as opposed to a kind of reverberation that's ongoing and an affective occurrence versus like a periodization that would restrict its power. And so I think, the kind of grammar of the event as this singular, unrepeatable happening that fits into teleology and progress and this racial liberal kind of horizon. And I wonder about the work that you single out and these other kind of like companions of speculation and futurism, and how those play with other forms of political temporality and eschatology that aren't about like messianic time, but instead, or like a kind of secular miracle, but instead are trying to think a different form of unworlding through and possibility. So those are some thoughts that came up in response to your blog post. So thanks.
That was beautiful, and thank you for that engagement, Che. I think that there are a lot of resonances across our papers and Bernard's elegant introduction, that we should sort of massage here today into a conversation about the way in which singular charismatic figures get elevated through sort of historical process to the point where they stand in for movements and the slow unfolding of events through cooperation, action, activism, thought, collaboration, hard work, labor, and so on. And I think Che and I are both struggling with the desire to tell stories about people who have sort of fallen out of the historical frame without reinstating the historical frame that chooses which stories to tell, and in the process does not choose, right? So we know that the archive is the selection process. It is constantly not selecting. And in those non-selections, there's the detritus of history, means that there are all of these other ways of telling history that are now no longer available. And I think in the way in which you give us this prismatic understanding of Kuromiya is a way of showing how to bring somebody into the archive without then stilling the archive in the process and saying, well, here's another charismatic figure to hold on to. And I think in the same way, we're both sort of resisting this idea of Stonewall as the watershed moment that all of gay, lesbian, and trans history must pass through on the way to becoming legitimate, legible, properly rebellious, in order to fashion the appropriate break between then and now, between being oppressed and being liberated, and so on. And that's not to say that Stonewall didn't happen, or that some of the people that we're discussing tonight, like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, were not involved in it, but it's to say that we have to resist the charisma of the selected individual and the selected event. Because without resisting that, we can only repeat the same narrative over and over again, and then lay the same structures for what is yet to come. And so that's why I have this focus in my work on unbuilding, in order to try to see whether, instead of passing on a legacy that is chock full with material, with people, with information, whether there's a way to do a kind of clearing that would allow for something else to happen, something that is not this. And I'm not under any illusions that I know how to do this, but I'm looking at artwork in particular where unbuilding and collapsing and demolishing was the focus. And a lot of the time, that work is associated with African American queer artists. And so it's obviously part of a desire to take apart a structure that is built upon the exclusion of these particular artists. So I'll get to telling you about those artists, but I'll also say that, like Che and like Connor, who's in the audience, I'm turning much more to the peers than to Stonewall to look for a kind of representative site to think about LGBT rebellion. The peers because the police were not there. The peers because this was a place where there were queer people who were cruising, and like David Wondrovich putting up murals, like Keith Haring. People were cruising and were having sex, and gay people were there doing those things. But there were also many other kinds of people, homeless people, drug addicts, drug dealers. And it's also not appropriate to turn the peers just into another chapter in gay history, but to recognize the peers as a kind of unmapped geography of desire, but also of assembly. And it's the assembly in the peers that interests me, not the cruising. And also the architectures of post-industrial collapse that get just seen as cast as the backdrop to gay male activity, when in fact they are themselves framing or opening onto other potential futures. So I was, after reading Che's piece, I turned to the Eric Stanley, and I kind of thought I knew what Eric Stanley was going to do, and then I didn't. I loved this piece so much. The introduction was fantastic. And it makes a couple of moves that I think are important to the conversation that we're going to have tonight. So, you know, for people who haven't read it or want to think about how to bring some of the material forward, they begin by reminding us that neoliberalism doesn't work by excluding people. It works by folding entire populations into a mechanism of rule. And therefore, inclusivity becomes the problem, not exclusion. And if you miss that this is the new tactic of governance, then you're simply going to be fighting the wrong battle in the wrong place. So this is an enormously important move that's built upon the work of people like Chandan Reddy, whose amazing book, Freedom with Violence, lays out exactly how it is that neoliberalism constantly folds white, lesbian and gay populations into systems of governance by assuring them that their safety depends upon the management of potentially violent populations of color. Okay, so inclusivity is the tactic, if you like, of neoliberalism. This then leads to two outcomes as far as Stanley is concerned. First, we have to be deeply suspicious of all systems of inclusivity, including the big ticket items like gay marriage, and he doesn't want to re-legislate that battle. This is not going to be about, well, there are some good things about gay marriage. You know, that's not the point any more than the point of this book is to restore certain figures to history. The point is to see that that tactic of inclusivity, wherever and whenever it occurs, is management and is the management of a potentially unruly or ungovernable population. Then second, and this is, you know, I would love to hear Bernard respond to this as well, we shouldn't be trying to reform the institutions that govern us, says Stanley. And this is the beginning, a kind of anarchist thread that runs through the book. There's no point trying to reform the law because the law has already arrogated to itself the right to violence. And the right to violence is both performed through violence, but also through these kind of, you know, legal, through acts, through crimes, through the manipulation of the prison system, and so on. So we shouldn't be trying to reform the law, medicine, universities, governments, and so on. We should be trying to take these institutions apart, because unless we were able to dismantle those institutions, we cannot change the mechanism of rule, because that's where rule comes from, right? So if we're seeking to be ungovernable, which is the implication of this essay, then you can't leave all of these reassuring structures intact. The university, along with everything else, is a mechanism of sorting the deserving out from the undeserving, right? And then charging you a lot of money for it should you fall into the category of the deserving. And in the process, and managing knowledge and determining what counts as knowledge. So instead, we have to offer alternatives that are outside of these seemingly inevitable remedies that we've been given: justice, remediation, and repair. As far as Stanley's concerned, justice, remediation, and repair are already part of the logic that we're trapped in. Okay, so then that leads to the question, well, okay, so now what? We're not asking for reform, we don't want to be included, well, what are we to do? Just sort of wander around saying no to everything? Yes, basically. But the answer, he says, is something to do with taking things apart, not building. And so he proposes, quote, justice would demand the dismantling of its own administration. Justice would demand the dismantling of its own administration. I'd really love us to talk about that as a project. What would that look like? So to push back to this earlier period, if we're looking for models of unbuilding and dismantling, in the 1970s, there were a lot of projects that were actually committed to dismantling and unbuilding. And it's why we see a lot of anarchist groups in the 1970s, precisely because the state had proved to be a disastrous form of governance in the middle of the 20th century, with the rise of fascism and totalitarianism. In the post-war period, young people, immigrants, people of color, anti-colonial freedom fighters recognized that the state was not going to deliver justice to them. And in that period, we see the Situationists appear. There's anarchist rebellions in France. There's, obviously there are socialist movements around the world, but the emergence of anarchism is pretty interesting at that moment. It's also the central, I think, motif in a lot of queer and feminist work from that period. And you only have to look at a film like Born in Flames that I mention in my essay to see what that would look like. And Born in Flames actually takes on the fact that socialism is the radical paradigm of the 70s. And Born in Flames says no to socialism by offering us a dystopia in which a socialist government has already come to power and has done nothing for women, for people of color, for poor people. And so the revolution is still to be fought. And that's what that film is about. And it remarkably says, how should we do this? Let's go to North Africa, get weapons, come back to the US, and blow everything up. And that's what the film is. You should watch it. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen next. It just gives you an incredible explosion at the end of the film of, no less a target than the antenna on top of the World Trade Center, which, as various commentators on the film have told us, was worked out in post-production so that the explosion was not actual, dynamite. In the film, it's glitter. And so it's this very queer, very campy material that disrupts everything at the end of Born in Flames. And there are many, many other examples from the 70s. Valerie Solanas, she doesn't say, I want to reform society. She says, I'm forming a society for the cutting up of men, right? That nowadays would bring, Andrea Long Chu accepted, that would bring a lot of raised eyebrows if you would say, I want to create a society to cut up a group. In the 1970s, it was like, yeah, I guess so. Andy Warhol was kind of sold on it for a minute. So these were violent proposals were made in aesthetic context that did not seem out of sync with the structure of feeling of the time. Let me put it to you that way. There was, of course, Ursula Le Guin's brilliant anarchist novel, 1974, The Dispossessed, in which the entire focus of the anarchists is to unbuild. And we are told repeatedly in The Dispossessed that the role of the anarchist in society is to unbuild walls. Now, there's no better symbol for abolition than the unbuilding of walls. And there are other problems with that particular dystopia, but the idea that through unbuilding walls, we open the way to participating in sharing and mutual aid suggests that the undoing of a capitalist logic cannot proceed through the idea of building. And this is where I would say to Eric Stanley that on the one hand, he's offering us this vision of dismantling institutions. On the other hand, he keeps falling back on the language of building. And so it's the piers were a sacred place for trans queer people of color who gathered there, building life from discarded hope. And it's that, there's a little bit of sentimentalism about building that remains in the essay that I would want to, I would worry about. Okay, I think I've already done this bit just to say that Stonewall happened. Of course it happened, but many people have contested its singularity as an event. Susan Stryker has made a film about the Compton cafeteria riots that happened earlier in San Francisco. Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg gives numerous examples of the arrests and rounding up of queens and butches in the gay bars all the way through the 1950s and various forms of resistance to that. People did not simply accept to being beaten and being arrested. People were in a constant state of revolt and refusal, and Stonewall was a kind of culmination. So it's better if we see Stonewall as representative of many other events rather than going into this memorialization that stabilizes a narrative of history that is more convenient to the status quo than these other multiple sites of rebellion would be. The Stonewall, I would say that Stonewall, and for those who are interested, Martin Manalonson a very long time ago wrote an essay saying, isn't it a problem that a North American bar in, New York City becomes a kind of global representative of LGBT rebellion? And he's reminding us that many other forms of LGBT community and resistance have emerged in other locations. And it doesn't make sense to run everything through this one site. But that same argument applies to the way in which we manipulate the memories of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And so in Stanley's words, he says, Sylvia and Marsha, along with many others, ought to be brought into the collective archive, but if their appearance does not destabilize the mode of their arrival, then we fail to do anything more than accommodate difference. This is the neoliberalization of identity as modernity's sedimentation. So it doesn't help to simply pick two people out of history either and elevate them, beatify them, turn them into saints, and now build the same narrative around the history of their participation, unless you're telling a narrative that is altered by their arrival, as Stanley says. So it would have to be a narrative about homelessness, and it would have to be a narrative, as Sylvia Rivera says in the clip that's on the site. It would have to be about prison and abolition. And if it's still a narrative about we're sick of having our bars raided, then Sylvia Rivera is just a pawn in that narrative. Okay, so I'll just conclude by giving you the three figures that I mentioned in my piece who we could discuss. And Che has already talked about Alvin Baltrop, and we might be interested in him for different reasons. I'm interested in him because he took these incredible photographs of the piers, and while you would expect him, and he has been read as focusing on gay men cruising there, if you actually look at the photographs, and there's one in my essay, the photographs are not simply of gay men cruising. They are mostly, the gay male figures are tiny, tiny little figures in the distance, because he often had to shoot from a huge distance, and he didn't have powerful lenses with him because it was dangerous. So you get this tiny figure of two men, and then this grand architecture of the piers collapsing in the background. So my point is simply, with Baltrop, let's read collapse. Let's not always be lured into the charisma of gay male sex, which in this moment is made into a diminutive representation of human futility, if you like, but that the photograph is about something bigger. And it's about structure, moreover, and structure that can come down. The second is to then go to the two figures that Che said they had never heard of. And that's because these are figures who have not in any way been preserved, even in the archives to which they've been attached. So one is Max Fellman, who, in these moments of repudiating the Michigan Women's Music Festival, should have no history in a trans history, because Max Fellman often was part of the women's music scene at the Michigan Women's Music Festival. And as you know, in 2015 there was, much earlier, there was a big standoff between trans women and women who understood themselves to be women-born women at the Michigan Women's Music Festival, who did not want trans women coming in. Max Fellman played in that festival every year. But they were also the first singer to openly sing a lesbian song on stage in the US, and was arrested for doing so. That was in 1969, before Stonewall. The song is on the website. You're welcome to listen to it. It's cast as women's music, but I read it as a punk anthem. It's called Angry at This, and it is an amazing song, actually, that has been, this was their one album. No one preserved this work. And yet it was a song, an anthem, if you like, of rebellion. In later years, Maxine transitioned and became Max. And that's a completely different story than the one that gets told about Michigan Women's Music Festival as simply lesbian separatists and then Camp Trans outside of it. There are lots of people in Michigan who also transitioned, and Max was one of them. Finally, then, Beverly Buchanan, and I've just started my work on Beverly. Beverly was a black lesbian artist who didn't use the term lesbian, doing work in the 1970s in New York City, came to Columbia to go to medical school, got disenchanted with medicine, and decided, I'm going to be an artist. What was her art about? She went to demolition sites and picked up rubble from demolition sites and found intricate patterns in the rubble. And this is what she says about it, and this is where I want to end, because this is an incredible image that she gives us. Why does she want this rubble from demolition sites? She said, well, my, is that the right passage? Yes, she says, my interest in walls involves the concept of urban walls when they're in various states of decay, walls as part of a landscape. Often when buildings are in a state of demolition, one or two structural pieces, and she uses the term frustula for structural pieces that remain when a building has been pulled down, stand out that otherwise never would have been created. You can't create this structure. It emerges out of demolition. This state of demolition presents a new type of artificial structural system that by itself, in its undemolished state, would not exist. These discards or piles of rubble can be pulled together to form new systems. These new systems are very personal to me. They are inspired by urban ruins, but created and then adorned by me in concrete and paint. Deceptively, she says, they appear to be black, and black is a very important motif in her work. Okay, so all I'm trying to say there is, this is remarkable what she's saying. She's saying that when you pull a building down, you're left with pieces that you could not have built in that shape. They are only there because of demolition. The demolition created them. It aesthetically birthed them. And when you see some shape like that, you're appearing at a new system, a new sign system, and that new sign system created through demolition deserves your attention. That's what I mean by unbuilding, dismantling, uncreating, is what would it look like what could we learn then from that kind of counterintuitive example that we cannot learn from those building narratives about singular figures and singular rebellions.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Che. So I want us to dig deeper and continue this specific kind of discussion. In part because actually the whole way in which this seminar series, Revolution 1313, originated in part was a response to a critique by Biodun Jeyifo that we focus too much on individual critical thinkers, right? And so actually the origin story in a way of this, what brings us here today, but actually what brings us to Revolution 13 from the beginning has been not, in a way, not to focus on individual thinkers, but to try and think of how together collective thought, collective revolutionary thought is made, right? And that's why, you know, when BJ opened up with our first seminar, it was more about it was about the Congress of Black Writers and Artists, 1956, 1958, right? It was, and although the conversation then focused predominantly, ultimately, on Fanon. But the idea was not individuals, but rather collectivities. That's why the second one was Nkrumah, James, Padmore. That's why one of them was the Combahee River Collective rather than individuals. And so this is a problematic that I think goes through these seminars, but it also touches these other spaces of critical thought as much as it does here. And so I'm really wedded to actually trying to work this out a little bit more, because it's very difficult ultimately. Why? Because there is a certain kind of emotional, libidinal attachment to identifying interventions that do work, that make us, that inspire us in a way, right? And there is, and listening to you, Jack, I hear something about Buchanan, I hear something about Feldman that is more than, that does relate to the person. There is something even in the expression. If I kind of like, if we were in the old days and I could hit the rewind button and get the cassette going back, there was a certain way in which you were speaking when you were talking about, I think when you were talking about Baltrop, and that there's this recuperation of a person, of something, of that does touch us in a particular way, and so ultimately, I mean, as I read your intervention, right? I mean, there are these individuals, people. There are these somatic experiences. Feldman, Baltrop, Buchanan, Kiyoshi, Kuromiya, right? That somehow allow us to then get into this in a space. And so how do we do this properly, really, without that? Why weren't the sections of the essay about something about space, peers, rather than headed by Buchanan, say, right? But does that even really do it well enough? In other words, even if we are today willing to say it's not, there is a collectivity there. It's the way in which people are thinking together, the praxis, the way the praxis is working together, that we're focusing on. I mean, even if we do the caveats, right? The caveats of saying, no, this isn't going to be, or Che, this isn't going to be your traditional kind of biography, right? Although it's a biography, right? How do we do that? So, now, this problem comes up through and through. It came up last time in the context of prison writings, particularly when we were talking about the GIP, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, which was this organization which was intended to be an anonymous collectivity that was intended to have many people in it. And we always talk about Foucault, right? And actually, not clear that we would know about the GIP if it weren't for Foucault. Not and the recent compilation that just came out, brilliantly edited by Perry Zern and Kevin Thompson, called "Intolerable," right? Well, it's Foucault's writing on the prisons, right? I mean, so how do we? There's a process of recuperation that is itself fraught, that causes these second-order displacements, but at the same time is helpful to us because we can make these moves. Right, that allows us to then dig into a collective experience, but I'm still not sure what we do. The title for this one, thanks, Che gave the title, which is Becoming Numerous. And I don't have the whole title in front of me right now. Queer and Trans Rebellion, right? We were going at some point with Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, and then we did that move to Legacies of Queer and Trans Rebellion. Although again, Legacies is probably a problem here. So we would need to restyle this, but it is a question of how to do this properly. Okay, and I want more. I want more because, in a way, that's the whole project of this Revolution 1313. It's not to think through individual thinkers, but to think through collective thought and praxis. Okay, so maybe we can continue this. Just a couple of other thoughts, because there were so many rich comments and also so many dimensions to this conversation. On the Eric Stanley work, so on the notion of ungovernability, we actually had done a lot of conversation, debate about this at an earlier 1313 where we were reading the Invisible Committee. It was now, and it was I think it was in Praxis series, and at that time I was particularly taken by the notion of ungovernability, precisely because it allows for something more actually than the Foucauldian notion of critique. And so I remember at the time feeling that what has always bothered me about Foucault's essay, What is Critique, is this idea that, well, critique is not being governed like this, but there's a recognition in that text that we ultimately will be governed. And of course, there is that notion, and maybe it's true. Maybe that's reality, and yet it's not enough. It's not enough to believe that we always will be governed. There's something much more powerful about raw ungovernability. And so I was finding that very attractive in the Stanley, also in the Invisible Committee writings, but as a way to really resist even more forcefully. It's almost as if one resists more forcefully if one believes one can be not governed, even if one might not be able to be not governed, or something like that. And so that's, I think, very powerful in this work, and I wonder how it ties exactly to this question of the individuated self, and the question of biography. And then maybe the two last points. One, yes, I agree that the language and discourse of the 1970s, we've been kind of commenting on this throughout this series, is so much more radical than what we have today. You know, you get that for instance, in Sartre's preface to Fanon, right? Where, I think it was like, if you kill a European, you're killing two birds with one stone, or something like that, right? I mean, the language of that we were accustomed to in that period is so dramatically more forceful than what we have today. I just wanted to emphasize that, and I don't know if that also ties to this question of how we go about creating non-individuated biographies of collectivities. And then there was you interpolated me on one thing, which I don't know, it's probably going to be it would be too much of a tangent, I think, to go into revolution versus reform right now. Although I do, what I did want to resist in the Eric Stanley introduction is the idea that alternatives need to be outside somehow. And that's simply, I'm not sure what this, I'm all for the outside, but I'm not sure where it is, in the sense that, right now I'm working a lot on notions that emerge from abolitionist thought, that are notions of cooperation, that is I think integral to abolitionist thought. But I don't necessarily think that cooperation is something that is outside. I actually think that it exists in multiple forms today, and it's a question of tapping into forms of cooperation as a result of abolitionist thought. But I don't think one needs to I think that one can find those forms of cooperation in routine life. And so I'm not sure that we necessarily need to go, I'm not sure necessarily that there's a inside outside that makes sense here for purposes of transforming the world rather than remediating it or repairing it, but actually transforming it. Okay, so those were just a few thoughts. There was so much rich in your presentations. I haven't touched on everything, but can we go deeper then? And how do we? Let me invite you to try one more round. Who wants to start?
Okay, just quickly, you can do these other kinds of histories that don't revolve around the charismatic individual. And the one that, of course, comes to mind is Wayward Lives, right? And you probably were thinking, same thing, Che, where you use the archives that have been formed through the management and incarceration mostly of young black women, and you turn the archive on its head and use that archive to tell stories of rebellion and refusal and resistance without finding singular people whose lives are going to stand in for everyone else's. And so she uses the language of the chorus repeatedly, the anarchy of black girls. She uses the category wayward, which is a legal category for, I believe it was called a status crime that was levied only against black women, and then turns this term that has been used to, limit and manage the movements of young black women around the city. You turn it, again, waywardness, you turn it into the language of what she keeps calling open rebellion. So it can be done. That book took, a decade to write because the archival research, which is somewhat hidden because the book is so beautiful to read that you don't immediately realize that it is the poetic language is the condensation of massive amounts of bureaucratic documents. It's very hard to do. It's right. I mean, but that's what I was thinking. Do you want to?
Yeah. Just a resounding yes to what you just said and how you articulated it. I think also the work of Brent Hayes Edwards, has been really amazing for Black Radical Archives, and his most recent book, Epistrophes, and it takes up the archives of jazz musicians that are, I think, not often thought with, their literary archives and their writings and their correspondence, and I thought that was a really powerful and innovative way to think the boundaries and limits and potentialities of the archive. And then I was just thinking also about, Bernard, what you said about the kind of political grammar of the 70s, and something that I noticed in my kind of research around Kuromiya is a sort of almost like ontological flattening that can happen, where it's like at one point he is thinking across spaces of violence in a way to kind of unify a resistance to them. So he makes a comparison. It's in the late 60s, and he's talking about Vietnam, and he's talking about being beaten by the police in Selma, and he says, like, this was a kind of aha moment for him, a consciousness-raising moment, where you know what it is like to be black in Mississippi, to be Vietnamese under the kind of colonial warfare, and then there's a kind of homology at work there. And so I think sometimes there's that kind of ruse of analogy, that what Frank Wilderson would call ruse of analogy, is operative, and it makes political solidarity more palatable and makes the movement feel capacious, and we're all in this together on this universal plane. But I think, so part of what a critical approach could be is to thinking about like the grammar of solidarity and how it's articulated at different moments, and how, like the archive, that might create a hierarchy of kind of what's visible, whose issues are being taken up. So to kind of unbuild, reverse engineer something that.
One more thing I would say, Bernard, in terms of ungovernability, is that there are lots of people who currently consider themselves ungovernable, and that's a kind of key term in a lot of indigenous struggle, for example, where people don't imagine that they are governed by the state, but that it is not their state and it is not their government. And there have been, there's an interesting essay by Jeff Corntassel about indigenous struggles in Ecuador in the 1990s that brought down a series of governments, one after the other. And finally, at the end of the 90s, whoever was the president at that point said, at this rate, the country's becoming ungovernable. And the indigenous people declared victory at that point, said that's our goal. We seek to be ungovernable. And so I think, what seems like a pipe dream in terms of certain activist struggles is in fact already a reachable goal under other banners, let's say. So I think following up on that idea of the ruse of analogy, we also don't want to pile too many different struggles under one heading, because of course they do all have different kinds of trajectories and goals. And ungovernability is, as far as I understand it, has been a large part of a lot of global indigenous struggles. And then finally, the piece about being outside. If Eric Stanley is suggesting that there's something that's outside the law, and would that be naive or miss the places of cooperation that you're talking about? But he's trying to reveal to us or outline for us the structure by which the law governs. And so he says, related, rather than imagining the law as a mechanism through which relief from such harm might be offered, it is one of its methodologies of proliferation. That's he's really good at this kind of this kind of sentence where he turns the perceived mechanism of something into, in fact, the place of violence as opposed to the place of remediation. He does it with a lot of economy, something that I really appreciate in this essay. Rather than imagining the law as the mechanism through which relief might come, it's actually one of its methodologies of proliferation. So when you go and seek relief from the law for something like, I was beaten up on the street, I'm a queer person, I was beaten up on the street, you are proliferating the reach of criminalization at that moment. So now someone's going to jail because you were beaten up, and queers are sold on security, white queer people are sold on security through a mechanism that will proliferate the legal construction of entire populations as criminal.
Right, which is kind of at the heart of the abolitionist debate today, right? I mean, and Omavi Shakur's working on that too. I mean, it's on the idea that the way in which that the law doesn't function as recourse, but as perpetuation. Omavi's writing about resisting arrest and the way in which that is used as perpetuation as well. That has to be right. Although it has to be right. It's not an although. It's though that has been at the heart of abolitionist struggle since its inception or something. But here on this inclusivity, the relationship between ungovernability and inclusivity, And so let's go one more round, but I do want to then open it up. So start signaling to me with your eyes and hands and whatnot that you want in. Here's the issue. I want to take us back to Texas, where I started. That is not an experience of inclusivity, I take it. That is the conventional, is it? I mean, so we're experiencing this right now in live time. It's not the conventional effort to include queer and trans and then govern, right? It is the criminalization, it is the traditional criminalization method in a way. So that kind of raises a question of, can you have it both ways? Or then is the theoretical structure then, I mean, I like the theoretical structure. I'm in favor of notions of kind of governmentality, right? Which is the idea of bringing you in so we can govern you. That was the idea of Volume 1, basically, right? So I like the theoretical structure, but is it almost non-falsifiable in a way? I realize that's a ridiculous term and positivist and whatnot, but it seems as if in Texas they're not using inclusivity right now. So it's kind of like you've got a dual strategy. You can either go with the inclusivity and govern, or go with the out and criminalize. How does that choice get made? Why is it that in this moment for trans children, the choice would be criminalize rather than include and govern? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So.
Yeah, but it isn't that choice. It's that the law is being used, as is medicine, to create a situation in which the law can step in and say, no, you may not use whatever substances you need to use in order to prevent yourself going through puberty or to use hormones in the way that you wish to use them. You will have to follow the protocols of both medicine and the law. So the management there is coming from the law again and medicine. Like, if you want to use puberty blockers and you want to use hormones, you shouldn't need the permission of an insurance company. You shouldn't need the permission of your parents. You shouldn't need the permission of a medical establishment that needs to verify that you are somebody for whom these substances are available. And then you shouldn't have a legal system that's available to come in that way. That's already overreach. That's already the problem with the law. The law isn't adjudicating. The law here is, in fact, continuing to proliferate sites of criminality using what seems to be a sort of system of common sense. Oh, these parents are abusive because they are participating in their child's transition. And we all know that transition shouldn't happen at this age. So these are exactly the places where we can see that institutions are not set up to do anything but protect the status quo.
Right. The law steps in the gay marriage context as well, right? I mean, so it's a legally regulated space. I mean, these are different legal instruments in part, although the criminal sanction is always there. But in other words, in both inclusiveness, which would be, well, we're going to bring you in and then regulate through all legal forms of, like, well, if you actually want to get separated, then we're going to figure out, who's going to have the children and all of the legal mechanism there. I think that I'm not sure that there's more law in one context than the other. I would think more that it's different instruments and manifestations and forms of legal regulation but the question I have, or that I find in this moment particularly, is how that decision is made as to whether to pivot towards soft, quote unquote, soft regulatory forms or hard regulatory forms. So the pivot towards kind of the legalization of and regulation of same-sex marriage or other forms versus the use of child abuse statutes as a way to regulate that behavior, right? So it's kind of like how does that choice happen, right? Of course, in this context, we have to look at the relations of power. We have to look at the political context. We have to look at the socio-political context. The fact that there's an election coming for governor of Texas, and this is kind of like going to be a deciding factor, right? I suppose Beto O'Rourke is going to be in there as probably the Democrat and against. Et cetera. So these are all the ways in which we can kind of make sense of it. But I mean, I think this problematizes a little bit inclusivity. It doesn't problemize inclusivity because inclusivity remains a clear device of regulation, right? But it does mean that there are multiple devices of regulation that are at play, which then raises the question of how is it that we pivot from, what is it that the forces are that pivot from one to the other? I don't know if, Che, you want to jump in, and then we're going to also start opening it up to questions. So if anybody wants to jump in, you should signal me right now. Yes, Cassidy? Yeah? Okay, great. We got a microphone for you here.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and for all of you being here. I initially had a different question, but I don't want to move us too far away, Professor Harcourt, from this problem that you're identifying, which is kind of like what is the mechanism of rule that neoliberalism, or more widely, like what's being chosen? Is it to include, or is it to go down this route of proliferating, as you were saying, Professor Halberstam, which I think is still doing the inclusion versus inclusion, like who's being invited into the dominant, who's being invited into whiteness, who's being invited into what is non-criminal in that situation. So I wonder if the situation here, because we kind of start from this point of where numerousness and that being this focus of neoliberalism and governmentality kind of being brought to its knees by numerousness and what that might mean for this inclusion, exclusion. I'm curious as to whether in Texas, or this choice to choose criminalization as opposed to this maybe an inclusion and regulation that way, is if we could look at it in the context of who becomes the subject here when we start to talk about these abuse regulations, and maybe that we're shifting the subject from trans kids who are being criminalized to now we're talking about the parents and what we want to invite the parents into this like mode of regulating. I don't know if I have like an answer. I just didn't want to move us too far from like this moment of like maybe it's not something different that's being done there, and maybe it's not something that's all too different from the inclusion tactic that we've been able to pull out of everywhere else. And then the other question that I had before this was to go back to something that you said at the very beginning, Che, that I thought I've been thinking about the whole time, which is the event and the moment and the logic of how we are able to pick out these singular parts of time and what temporality is able to do specifically to kind of distract us and make us really centered on this, like, just drawing us into a particular moment as something we must pass through for either the progress or where we're going forward or where we're not going forward. So thank you. That wasn't super coherent as a question, but
No, that was terrific, Cassidy. Thanks so much. Yeah, no, it raises questions both about the subjects, right? The multiplicity of who is being targeted and how are we regulating, and how in this case are the parents being brought in, who would be brought in through other mechanisms as well, are brought in through other mechanisms as well, as Jack, as you were saying, through the medical process, through the insurance process, right? Who's filling out the insurance forms and payment process and all of that, but then who are then the target of the criminalization or abuse, and then also those questions of temporality. So any thoughts on that? Do you want to jump in?
I was just going to respond to the part about temporality. There's a beautiful, I don't remember which text it is. I'll have to look it up and I can tell you after. It's in one of Fred Moten's, he has the new trilogy, basically. I think it's in Black and Blur, but he's talking about the idea of the event in Hartman, and how Saidiya Hartman, and how she talks about the non-event of emancipation. And he says something really beautiful, like, the event is all used up, there's nothing left. So the term's inadequacy to account for, and the absence of, the lack of its explanatory power to account for the violence of slavery's continuation. And I think that a lot of the problem with the kind of eventalization of Stonewall relates to, this type of periodization and its cathedralization, and how that's kind of mobilized in ways that delimit its force. So, yeah.
I'll just say one thing. I thought Cassidy made a really important point, which is that, inclusion is already part of a system of privilege. Who is invited in is part of another mechanism here of regulation. Of course, not everybody is invited in, or even the invitation, for example, if it comes in the form of marriage, might be very inviting for middle-class people who, say, want to file taxes together, or put each other on their very good health insurance, but might be way less of a compelling invitation to people who aren't thinking in terms of taxes and are not accessing that kind of health insurance and so on. So I think the inclusivity, the fact that inclusivity is a neoliberal tactic that is particularly directed at white middle-class subjects is an important point there. And then the other thing, Bernard, when you were saying that, you have the medical filling out of forms on behalf of the child by the parent, and then you have the law stepping in and saying, we see from these forms that you have permitted your child to go on puberty blockers, and then you said, and there's going to be a new governor race. So then we see that these institutions that seem as if they're separate are actually constantly caught up in a kind of cycle of validation, such that the governor's race demands a certain kind of issue be foregrounded. And so this is a good moment for medicine and the law to collaborate on the outlawing of a subject who cannot fight back by virtue of not being of age, right? So it's the kid, the status as child, that makes this particular subject perfect for a clean fight on the way to a gubernatorial run, right? Because this child is not represented by the law except by their parents. And this child is already outside of many of these systems. And so the question of the outside is answered in the fact that you have here a subject who is currently outside of the law, even if in a few years they'll be drawn into those regulatory systems. At the moment, that person cannot go to the chemist and say, I'm here for my puberty blockers. They need the parent. And then the parent has to sign the form. This brings in the law, and so on. So it's a cascading system of institutional functions that nest in each other and seem invisible, and yet are scripting through what Dean Spade calls an administrative logic. They're scripting trans life through seemingly banal, everyday mechanisms like I have to fill out a form, as opposed to through spectacular refusals of recognition.
Yeah. And, and when we turn to the gubernatorial election dimension, right, then that raises, somehow it raises it raises the question of culture wars as political devices, right? Because when we turn to that dimension, then that fits neatly in the stories of culture wars surrounding abortion, Texas, Alabama, as well as transgender children, and that seems very easy to understand, those kind of culture wars, by contrast, say, to some of these more complicated mechanisms of inclusivity. And so I'm kind of interested in the relationship between the two, to kind of keep, like, so the question would be, and then I'm going to pass it, I think, to Nikita Shepard. Yeah, the question the question that's in my mind right now is, what is the relationship between the struggles associated with inclusiveness and governing through forms of governmentality versus the more disciplinary techniques that seem to be associated with culture wars, which of course is, one way of thinking about it would be the relationship between disciplinary mechanisms and governmentality. But I don't know if, at least that's how I'm filtering some of this, but I'm not sure yet. Nikita, you want to jump in?
Hi. Thank you so much for all these thought-provoking comments.
Thanks for joining us.
Thinking about this problem of trying to understand legacies of queer and trans rebellion without defaulting to this mode of representation of particular iconic figures that, fixes or captures these beautifully inconsistent lives. It's a tricky problem, particularly considering that the stake that contemporary trans and queer people have in historical representation, not just emotionally and psychologically, but also in the case of discourses like are happening in Texas right now, it's so important for the right to portray trans kids as historically unprecedented in this way that forces us to misremember centuries of very queer children's history to do that. But in trying to think past that, I think back to some of the revolutionary visions of early gay liberation, and one of my main reference points for that actually is Kiyoshi Kuromiya, and I'd love to hear Che, if you want to expound on some of this, but one of the most powerful ideas that I encountered in learning about queer and trans history was a moment from 1970 when Kiyoshi Kuromiya was a part of this revolutionary convention that was organized by the Black Panthers, and gave this report back from the Gay Male Caucus, in which he argued that the revolutionary vision of the Gay Male Caucus was not to create, not to advocate for the civil rights of a sort of fixed identity group within the broader American polity, but rather to recognize that gay people, as they understood themselves, formed a natural vanguard in the struggle to unlock the queer potential inherent in all people. That was a necessary part of a broader social and sexual transformation that would lead to revolution. And that's just such a wildly different vision than the sort of like neoliberalization of identity that Stanley criticizes. And thinking about that, it seemed like there's these interesting resonances with, even this idea of justice as a process that undoes its own administration. I'm wondering if maybe we can rethink queer history or legacies of queer and trans rebellion as a process that necessarily dismantles its own coherence by focusing not on these sort of like, captured beautiful inconsistencies in the form of neoliberal identities, but rather these sort of vectors of desire that have recurred in so many different times throughout history that we can connect to today across many different lines of difference. So curious if folks have any thoughts about how we can work around this both in queer history and in queer and trans politics today.
Thanks, Nikita. Do you want to start, Che, on the...
Yeah, sure. I was just going to say I really appreciated your kind of historicization of the trans child and, the work of the author of the book that I think you're holding is like really important and key to that. So just wanted to give a shout out to Jules Peterson. And I really also appreciated your kind of reading of that moment at the Panthers Revolutionary People's Convention. And I put this in like a footnote in the blog post, but I was on Twitter recently, and Hill Malatino, who wrote the book Trans Care that came out, I think, last year, made this really cool observation about how the statement that was from that caucus actually like talks about everybody can get sex change and hormone access that they want that we can't get right, that folks can't get now that we're talking about right now. And that was, early 70s. And it also made me think about that, caucus was called the Gay Men's Caucus, but there were always like trans femme people inside. And that was, I think, part of the kind of like violence of effacement and neoliberal, reductionism or something is like, now we have like cis, trans, and they're split and seen as very discrete identities, but actually like if we look at the history, there was much more of a continuum in this category of like non-men. And in Philly too, there was a group called the Radical Queens. So I think thinking about transness and Sylvia Rivera, when she did that speech that's part of the resources for tonight, and she's up there, talked about the gay power. And gay was such a affectively and socially charged term. And I think that, I mean, I don't have much more to say except that what you said about kind of like finding that, I don't know if you call it like libidinal or whatever it is, the kind of, that charge, like reactivating it as opposed to this kind of other stuff that we're all critiquing tonight, And it made me think of, I was looking it up here. There's a book, it's like Spirit of 68, maybe it's Gay Liberation Spirit of 68. It's, I'll look it up and then I'll mention it again. But it's an older text that's been retaken up, and there's gonna be do you know? I don't know that. Okay, all right. It'll take me a second, but it's like, I think it's via Duke Press, and there's an upcoming discussion with like Mackenzie Wark and some other folks about it. But yeah, there's something, how to like get in touch with that kind of affect, maybe, or political emotion is a really interesting question. So thanks.
Just one other thought to Nikita's question, and of course, Nikita, I know you're doing these different kinds of histories that do dismantle the framework through which history has been authorized. But I've been thinking about Christopher Chitty's book, which I don't know, Nikita, I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. called Sexual Hegemony. And yeah, it's a really, he was a graduate student who killed himself at the end of his graduate career, and then his friends put the book together from his dissertation. It turns out to be a kind of stunning rewriting of queer history as not at all the history of singular people who have been hidden from history, but a series of operations under capitalism by which homosexual community or homosexual acts are used to run the city. So he goes back to, for example, 15th century Venice and Florence, and he looks at the ways in which wealthy men were managed by their relationship to the sodomitical. They could be shamed and they could be exposed, and so they were manageable. And young boys who could be rebellious and riotous were also constrained by the particular legal ramifications of sodomy at that time. And he takes the argument all the way through to gay pride and says, now we have a new form of capital. We're not collecting fines any longer for sodomy. We are precisely making money off of so-called sodomitical acts, off of gay communities, and therefore we have to look at the relationship between the management of particularly sex acts between men, powerful men and young men, and you know, the different forms of capitalism that collect around them and manage them. That doesn't require you to say anything about a particular individual. The only one he mentions in that chapter on 15th century Italy is Machiavelli. And he says, how has anyone taught Machiavelli separate from the history of sodomy? He's like, it's beyond me, because most of the machinations that are alluded to in the prints involve sodomitical encounters that the state is desperately trying to manage, either to, you know, punish or to fine, or in fact to gather information from wealthy men using young men, something like that. So these uses of sodomy suggest that this unbroken history of heroic people who stood up to homophobia, I mean, it's just nonsense, you know, it's nonsense in the 20th century, and it was nonsense in the 15th century. Only problem for Chitty? No women. No women. There's just no women in this history whatsoever. So there's a weird moment where he says, in this period, young boys went to market because women were confined to the house, and therefore they had more access to men at that time. I'm like, women were confined to the house? Say more. Let's explore that. You know, that's also an interesting narrative about capital. But if you bring Silvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, together with Sexual Hegemony, you actually do accomplish some of what Nikita's proposing in terms of dismantling the way in which we have understood LGBT history.
Thanks. Did you want to add something, Che?
Oh, just the book. It's
right.
It's called Gay Liberation After May '68. It's I'm gonna probably mispronounce the last name. Guy Hockenham. Oh yeah. And Deleuze did the.
Hockenham.
Yeah.
Guy Hockenham. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Deleuze did the foreword,
Okay.
but it's a translation by Scott Branson. So that's the book I was thinking about.
Right. Great. So we have two questions that are coming in on the Zoom. The first is from Sarah Bianchi. And so thanks for joining us, Sarah. I know it's 2:45 a.m. in Germany. Thanks for being with us. Why don't you go first? And then I've got Callie McKenzie. Maybe we'll take both questions, and then we can use that as a way to maybe have some concluding thoughts. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for the possibility to join the seminar in New York. And I really like the idea how you problematized the notion of inclusiveness in terms of neoliberalism. And my question would be, if one is all the time manageable, how can one start to resist and becomes ungovernable? Because there's not this tipping point, but somehow a slower transitioning process, if I have understood you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And can we also have Kali McKenzie on? How does that, is that going to work? Hi.
Sorry. Hi.
Thanks for joining
I'm
us.
in my dorm. I'm an undergrad student.
That's good.
I just wanted to say, first of all, this has been awesome. Like, I never thought I would get a chance to like ask a question to like you two. Like, that's really cool to me, which may not seem that cool, but it's pretty cool to me. It's like meeting pretty big people in my lives. Jack Halberstam, you were the first queer theory book I ever read, and I was like 15. So yeah. My question was about, we talked about Greg Abbott and all this stuff, and I wanted to talk about kind of the methodological tactics that were being used in this new Don't Say Gay Florida bill that's been recently passed by the House, and like what are the methodological tactics being used to like create the subject for this to happen? I don't know if that makes sense. I really hope it does, but yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about the bill and how it functions.
Sorry, yeah. I just wanted to talk more about how this bill is creating this like false exclusivity, but also this false inclusivity where like the relationship between like queer teachers and queer students are changing now in addition, and also how like, yes, this is being created, but how was the subject created in order for this to happen? So what's been happening for this to even exist? I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry.
I'm gonna get some. You want to start with the first question, maybe, which has to do with questions of how to become ungovernable when one is when one is in a totalitarian way governed, I suppose, right? And then I'll talk a little bit about the Florida bill.
Okay. Yeah, Sarah, there isn't an easy way to say how you step outside of inclusivity. As Cassidy said earlier, not everyone is anyway invited into the inclusive circle. So it's more about all of these tactics are instructive as to how power works rather than prescriptive in terms of how to step outside of governance. And I think especially in this era, what we need to do is move much more slowly and not imagine, as we've been saying all evening, that one event will bring some house of cards down. It will not. We have to be strategic in response. And I think what I'm saying is that we have to find ways to engage in all kinds of activities and forms of relation outside of the institutional methods that have been assigned to us to carry out these practices. So if we're talking about praxis today, the question would be, how can we engage or produce or create praxis that does stand outside of institutional methods of connection and network and so on? And again, there are people who do this already. This is not like some science fiction future that will never come. This is more about looking to communities where mutual aid is already a principle. And Dean Spade has circulated a book during the pandemic on mutual aid and run workshops of how to. And there are neighborhoods where people are engaged in sharing heat, sharing cable, sharing all kinds of things that allow them to sort of literally pull energy from authorized companies and use it in unauthorized ways. And I think that's more the program here.
All right, and then just a word on the Florida bill, which is colloquially called the Don't Say Gay bill. It's officially known as the Parental Rights in Education bill, and it's kind of like the functional equivalent of all the banning CRT that's going on right now. And in Florida, what it basically does is it would prohibit Florida educators from talking to primary school children about certain LGBTQ plus topics that are supposedly not age appropriate. So it's kind of the banning knowledge, right, and conversation, right.
And that's just a complete, misreading of children. As if like children are the ones who actually, kids know about difference in different ways than adults do, and this idea that the child knows nothing until you reveal it to them. I mean, there's just, before we even get into the censorship of queer material, one would have to say, what model of education is this? This idea that a child, is just a tabula rasa, and now you're going to lay down certain material and that will be corrupting. I mean, that is a problem for the child, no matter what the content of the material would be that you were talking about. That is a pedagogically impoverished, way of thinking about education. That's a real bill? Is that a real bill?
It's a real bill. Apparently, it passed the House in a 69-47 vote, and Senate Appropriations Committee is going to advance the. Yeah, so
then you add your next institution that you want to dismantle, the government.
Right. Okay, we've got another question here. Let's bring that in.
Hey, thanks.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Daniel Villatoro. I'm Guatemalan, and I'm a human rights fellow here at Columbia. I wanted to ask you about forms and what we were talking about, inclusion. My main topic of research is data on and representation in violence records for LGBT violence. So now that these categories are, being used, included, recognized, how do we see these for the future? You have worked with archives, back, but let's think about archives for the future. Now that we're being included in the records, into these systems of governance and management, what can you think, for the future of this? And I just really always repeat that administrative forms, like, the main space of heteros is normativity. Like, that's their space. So, but we have to use them somehow, and we're being included in them somehow. So let's think about the future. How do you see this for the archives of the future?
Che, do you want to jump in the archives for the future? That seems like a nice reversal of where you spend your time.
Yeah. I think I would want to sit more with the question, but thanks. Yeah.
Are you saying how do we assemble archives? No.
No, like seeing what you could do with what happened when we were at the margins, not what we're being included in all these kind of records. How can we see the future of, doing legacies of queer and trans rebellion happening now, for example, or the outliers, or the individualities and the numerous that you were talking about?
So, so the question really goes to the question of how to build future archives of the future, I think, right? And some of our colleagues are doing this work. Actually, Derica Purnell, who's also with us at the IJS, is doing that work of trying to create archives of existing movements now, right? And in a way, it's the attentiveness to what has historically not been in the archive that can guide us in producing future archives. That seems that would be an extraordinarily important task, particularly given our greater recognition today of erasure, right? And all the work that's been done on the erasures in the archives. Yeah. So thinking creatively about how it is that one produces an archive of the present. I think that the fact of the digital age should allow us to greater ability to mine the present in a way that we weren't able to in the past. I mean, one of the things about past archives is that they're very majoritarian. I mean, a majority of them come from the legal context, in part because that's where there were scribes who were reporting. That's when there was the requirement of a form of a transcript. I mean, so much of it was produced in the legal context. You see that well when you read Saidiya Hartman's work, right? Venus in Two Acts, or David Kajanian's work also. So that it's predominantly in the context of litigated disputes that these archives were formed, and they allied certain things because there are certain parties that don't have a voice in that, whatnot. But you would think that somehow one of the potentials of the digital age is to record, scrape, and mine and collect kind of all of our communication, all of our actions. I mean, that's both what is frightening and dangerous about the expository society, but it's also, insofar as it might be an archive for 100 years from now, it's also what creates something that could be extraordinarily rich.
Yeah, and you might look at an essay by Maria Elena Martinez, who wrote about a case in Guatemala. You probably know it, this essay. But one of the things that Maria Elena Martinez says is when she finds in the archives, in the colonial archives, a case of a person with an enlarged clitoris who is read as being in between sexes and then prosecuted accordingly, Maria Elena Martinez says, from the perspective of the present, it isn't enough to go back and grab these figures and say, oh, I found a queer person in the archive. Because in fact, in the colonial period, that's exactly who was in the medical archive, because they stood out as oddities or freaks. And so the archive is replete with bodies that are oddly shaped or seem to be somehow suspended between recognizable sexes and so on. So that's an important point, that we shouldn't just grab onto what is there. We should also be attentive to the missing pieces of the archive. But then finally, and I think this goes back to Che's opening, it's not just about what archive material do you pass on. It's like, what methods can we put in place in order to process differently the material that's both available and unavailable. So what methods of retrieval, memorialization, and inscription, for example, and how might those methods provide for different kinds of histories in the future?
Terrific. So we're coming to the end of our time, and wondering if we have any last thoughts. One that lingers with me right now is whether what are, and this is a too large a topic to raise at the end of this seminar, but what are the differences and unique attributes of some of these problematics in the queer and trans rebellion context versus in other contexts, right? And that's something that I'm particularly interested in. In other words, so we've been talking about like recuperation, right? And the second order displacements, as Eric Stanley was talking about, and issues of identity and neoliberal questions of individuated subjectivity. And one thing that this strikes me is, of course, these issues arise also in other critical theory contexts. And it's not as if any of these are separated. Obviously, Che, you're particularly showing us the way in which there's the overlap of queer and trans rebellion and carcerality and anti-blackness. So it's not as if these are separate spheres, but one thing that does intrigue me is what are the differences that would be specific to this conversation we're having today versus some of the other ones we're having, you know, in previous sessions. But in any event, that might be too big a topic, although it's something to think about in relationship to the other seminars. Do we have any final concluding thoughts, inspiring thoughts of where to go from here?
Nothing inspiring, but
world breaking,
yeah,
world destroying.
That would
perhaps?
be the wrong way to end here. But there are specific things, particularly in trans history, that are challenging. As Sandy Stone said many years ago in the Transsexual Manifesto, trans people have been programmed to disappear. And so the whole point of transition was that you would seamlessly enter back into society as a man or a woman, which was already a fantasy. And therefore the history, your history, even your personal history, had to disappear into the correction that had been accomplished through transition. And you know, young people, of course, do not think that way anymore, although there is still this fixation on dead naming, you know, where it's like, oh, don't use my name Judith because I'm now Jack, even though I've published under that name and I have traveled under that name and I do not completely disassociate with that name, right? So there's a desire to just be the person you've become, and that reading of subjectivity is all wrong to me. We also need a more post-structuralist reading of subjectivity in order to avoid these charismatic figures, these singular events, but also these histories within which you emerge fully formed, as opposed to being, in the words of Eric Stanley, beautifully inconsistent. And part of that inconsistency is that you may have entered the world under one kind of inscription, and now you live under another. And both of those things can be true simultaneously and should be held onto. But that requires a different politics and a different form of writing history. And then the other thing is that histories of trans and queer have been entwined in ways that are also very complicated. I gave you the example of Maxine Feldman, who was a lesbian and did participate in a separatist event, but then did transition and wrote this very singular anthem of rebellion. So what do you do with her? Do you damn her because she was part of Michigan, or do you claim him because he did come out as a trans man? That's the inconsistency, and if you want beautiful inconsistency, you cannot have identity politics. You just can't. You're going to have a capacious understanding of history, futurity, self, other, goal, trajectory, and so on. And I'm not in the school that wants to see queer theory as something that has gobbled up trans histories and trans theory. I think that queer and trans are sort of fellow travelers that are constantly intertwined with each other, have made rebellions together, and will continue forward, you know, hopefully with a politics built out of solidarity, not distinction.
Thank you, Jack. And that really opened up a whole other can of worms that, boy, we could go for another 2 hours now, huh? Jay, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess two thoughts that come to mind are, so the title Becoming Numerous comes from an essay that's called Queens in Exile, The Forgotten Ones, and it's title of a Sylvia Rivera speech when she was living. And I guess a question I have is like about scale, like becoming numerous, and we talked about Vanguard, we talked about assembly, and there's different modalities of revolutionary forms and change. And I think that's kind of an open question about like scale to accomplish the unbuilding. And yeah, so that's a question I'm left with. And something else I'm thinking about has to do with like, you know, in your blog post, Bernard, you talked about the ways in which a lot of these figures have participated in other movements and kind of brought that folded that into their struggle. And there's also at the same time a history of kind of extimacy, like intimacy within but being excluded from the anti-war movement, et cetera. And I think that's something that is like a tension that lives within, maybe it's even, I don't know if it's singular, but it's like specific to when I think about queer and trans leftist history, like people participating in these movements and then at the same time being elided out of them and having to confront that in the organizing. So, and build an alternative, I guess. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Jack. And so, yeah, without launching back in, it's kind of like it's the paradox or the tension between the fluidity of identity and identity, idem, but the necessary fluidity, which then could raise many questions about the claim of not having an identity politics, if one is allowed to think of identity politics as being somewhat fluid. But we'll have to continue the conversation, right? Maybe we will end, Jay, on the passage, I think, which you refer to in your text, which is Sylvia Rivera's resounding call, right, as you wrote and quoted Sylvia Rivera. We have to show the world that we are numerous. There are many of us out there. And which then gave us our title, Becoming Numerous. So thank you immensely for joining us and for everything you've contributed and for your essays and for these presentations and conversations, Jack and Che. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, David, and everyone at the People's Forum for all your help. Fonda Shen, thanks immensely for making this all possible. And you know, the beautiful thing is, well, I do want to tell you to come next time, or what the next one is. The next one is going to be on March 22nd. It's a Tuesday, March 22nd. We will be in Frankfurt at the Institute for Social Research, and we'll be thinking revolution with and against critical theory. We'll be reading Hans-Jürgen Kahl, the SDS student movement, so not any one individual, but the entire SDS movement, and its confrontation with the Frankfurt School, particularly with Adorno and Horkheimer, and how to think about that moment, which was an extraordinary moment of critique and praxis, of course. But before we go, we're actually live, right? We're in person, so we get to clap and thank and applaud and not... Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Che. Not use that little Zoom hand thing. We get to actually applaud. Isn't that nice? All right, thank you, everyone. See you soon.